They buried him in 1954, what was left of him, or so they thought. The fire had taken everything, the chapel, the congregation, the doctrine, the boy. No one spoke of the Church of the Glass Flame after that summer. It was easier to believe it had all been a mistake, a fevered myth wrapped in smoke and silence. But 71 years later, on a cloudless morning in rural Missouri, he walked out of the woods barefoot and breathing, unchanged, unaged, and holding a photograph that hadn't existed in this timeline. "I never died," he whispered. "Time just forgot where to find me." Like this video, subscribe to Mystery Cults, and comment if you believe in forgotten truths. The town of Arden's Hollow had forgotten its sins. That's what made it dangerous. Nestled between endless cornfields and rivers that used to carry trade, it had once been a center of whispers, of things buried in cellars, of sermons held in shadows, and of 13 people who vanished when the chapel burned in 1954. No remains, no records, just a single news clipping that called it an unfortunate structural collapse. But local legend always spoke of something else, a ritual gone wrong, or maybe one that went exactly as planned. On July 6, 2025, Officer Maria Kensley received a 911 call about a man wandering along Route 9. She expected a lost hiker or a drug case. What she found instead froze her in place. The man looked 25 at most, barefoot, wearing a style of clothing that hadn't been seen outside of documentaries, high-waisted slacks, wool vest, shirt buttoned to the neck, and a thin leather strap tied around one wrist like a rosary. His eyes weren't vacant. They were ancient. And when she asked his name, he replied calmly, "Elias Varnum. I've come back because the veil is thinning again." Maria took him in, half out of protocol, half because her instinct screamed he wasn't lying. In the interrogative room, when asked where he came from, he didn't say a place. He said a time, June 12, 1954, right before the fire. At first, they thought it was a delusion, until a background search pulled a death record for Elias A. Varnum, born 1932, declared deceased in the chapel blaze. But here he was. His fingerprints matched. His DNA lined up with the only known living relative still in state records. Yet the body before them hadn't aged a day. Inside his pocket was a photograph, charred at the edges, showing a girl in 1950s attire beside a chapel long gone. The date scribbled in faded ink, June 10, 1954. But what chilled Holt, the federal investigator called in to examine the case, wasn't the girl. It was the man beside her, wearing the exact same clothes Elias wore now. Even more disturbing, the image had never been developed. Not on paper, not digitally. The lab said the photo didn't match any known printing method used in the 20th century. And then there was the smell, something Maria would later describe in her statement as old wood, burnt wax, and something metallic. It followed him like a second shadow. When he walked into the precinct, 3 clocks slowed down. Not stopped, slowed, just enough to notice, just enough to doubt what reality had once seemed so sure about. Elias didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for water. He just sat down and asked one question. Is the flame still waiting? They kept the boy's return quiet. For now. Only a handful of federal officials, one local sheriff, and the woman who had once watched the chapel burn were told. Her name was Anne Delaney, and in 1958, she had been just 12 years old, hiding under a pew when the fire started. She never spoke of what she saw, not to her parents, not to the town's priest, and definitely not to the investigators who showed up days later and sealed everything away. But when she said of the news report in 2006, the boy in the grainy surveillance footage outside the gas station was unmistakable. It was her brother, Elias. Anne had long believed he had died in the fire like the rest of them. But now, with the same crooked smile, the same eyes that used to stare at the stars and whisper strange verses from books he wasn't old enough to understand, he was walking around the world again. She hadn't aged well. Time had taken her knees, her memory, and her will to believe. But when the agency asked if she could come to the facility and speak with him, she agreed, not because she believed it was him, but because some part of her still woke up hearing him call her name. Inside the federal black site, an old Cold War bunker an hour outside Knoxville, Elias sat quietly, answering only in fragments. He knew the names of every agent before they introduced themselves. He asked for bread and water, nothing more, and when Anne walked in he said, "You grew into your sadness." She wept instantly. But what chilled Holt, lead investigator on the case, wasn't the family reunion. It was the book Elias carried when he was picked up by highway patrol. Bound in cracked leather, its first page read, "Chronicle of the Flame, transcribed 1906, initiated for the final spiral." It wasn't just a relic. It was an exact match to a manuscript destroyed in a fire inside the Library of Congress archives in 1962. Elias's copy smelled like ash and cedar. Pages were marked in Latin and Old English. There were drawings, ritual circles, hourglasses shaped like open eyes, and most disturbingly, a sketch of a boy kneeling before fire. The caption read, "He who walks backward may never burn." Agent Darren Holt had interrogated cult leaders, conspiracy theorists, and self-proclaimed prophets for most of his 22-year career, but Elias unnerved him in ways he couldn't articulate. It wasn't the confidence or the calmness, it was the timing. Elias always spoke when the room went quiet, as if the silence itself obeyed his rhythm. On the third day of observation, Holt entered the chamber and placed a flat file on the table. Photos of the burned chapel, original reports from the 1958 fire, even the article that once dismissed the Church of the Glass Flame as rural hysteria. Elias glanced at the stack, then tapped the image of the chapel's stained glass window. "That's where the spiral began," he said. "What spiral?" Holt asked. Elias raised his wrist. Burned into his skin, either by ritual or time, was a circular brand with 7 notches along the outer ring. Holt had seen that symbol before, buried deep in a CIA document from 1974 labeled OP Vortex, a defunct Cold War program aimed at harnessing psycho-religious triggers for wartime advantages. Most of the content had been redacted, but one phrase stuck: "Time bends near belief." "I didn't travel," Elias finally said. "I was kept, preserved. The ritual wasn't fire, it was flame, and flame doesn't destroy if you step into it with purpose." Holt leaned forward, his pen hovering over the notepad. "Kept where?" Elias didn't blink. "Between ticks." He explained, or tried to, that time doesn't always move forward, that some places, especially ones soaked in belief and pain, act like mirrors, and if enough faith is poured into them, they stop reflecting and start remembering. The Church of the Glass Flame had not intended to create a time bridge. It believed it was calling down divine judgment, purifying the worthy by pulling them out of corrupted time and placing them into a suspended moment of divine waiting. Elias had been chosen, or at least that's what they told him. "I could hear them," he said, "even when I was gone, the prayers, the screams, and sometimes the silence between both." The old church grounds had long been repurposed. A gas station now stood where the glass flame once burned, its pumps humming over the bones of forgotten doctrine. But beneath the concrete slab laid something the town never rebuilt. The chapel's original foundation, hidden under layers of fill dirt, decayed timber, and silence. Agent Holt pulled strings to initiate a geoscan of the site. What the techs found buried under the south wall shocked even the most skeptical among them. A sealed trapdoor beneath the ground, unlisted on any historical record. The door led to a single narrow staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. The chamber at the bottom was lined with candle stubs, each one melted in the same direction, as if time had tilted. The walls were covered in carvings, a flame inside an hourglass, inverted crosses twisted into spirals, and a single Latin phrase chiseled with trembling hands: "Illi qui ambulant retrosum non comburentur." Holt later translated it: "Those who walk backward will not burn." Everything reeked of iron and oil, and something ancient, like dust that had been dreaming. At the center of the room was a stone slab, blackened and scorched, with ash patterns that suggested more than fire. Holt crouched beside it, fingers grazing a charred ring, and found a small copper chain fused to the stone. A medallion. He recognized the sigil immediately. It was the same one branded onto Elias's wrist. Back at the facility, Elias had grown quieter. His appetite had vanished. He stared at the walls like he expected them to open. When Holt showed him a photo of the underground room, Elias's reaction was immediate. He placed a hand on the glass of the printout and whispered, "This was the waiting room. They said the Chosen would hear the countdown." "What countdown?" Holt asked. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something over and over in near sigh. Lent breath. 2 left. 1 returned. The spiral needs 3 to close. Holt felt the temperature drop. His radio clicked with static. Somewhere deep inside this investigation, something ancient had begun to stir, and it wasn't finished. For the next several days, Elias barely spoke, except to hum low hymns in the same strange meter, stopping only when asked about the second mentioned in his chant. 2 left, Holt had repeated from his notebook. 1 returned. What does that mean? Elias didn't answer directly. Instead, he traced a symbol into the table's condensation, a spiral within a spiral. Then, in a voice more like memory than sound, he muttered, "He didn't want to come back. I did. That's the difference." Holt turned to Anne Delaney again, hoping her childhood recollections could provide insight. She remembered her brother had never been alone. There had been another boy, a foster child brought into the congregation just weeks before the fire. His name was Mason Rell, but Mason had no surviving records, no family, and after the fire, no one in town ever mentioned him again, as if the church had buried more than bones. Holt pulled files from National Archives, old census rolls, even orphanage records, but there was no trace of a Mason Rell ever existing, until one chilling match came from a 2006 highway camera in West Virginia, a man walking alone at night, barefoot, holding a candle in his bare hand with no wax dripping. The timestamp on the photo, 3:33 a.m., the exact minute Elias had been taken into custody, 173 miles away. Elias looked at the photo and whispered, "They're trying to pull him forward," but he's stuck between bells. Holt was no longer sure who they were. Were the cult members truly gone? Or had they, like Elias, found ways to avoid time's natural decay? Elias spoke of the spiral's closure, claiming it needed 3 returnees to seal the temporal wound. He insisted he wasn't the first, but rather the only one who had stepped willingly. That the ritual in 1958 had fractured more than fire. It had opened time itself. "I remember his scream," Elias said, eyes hollow. "He didn't go backward, he went sideways. If you were in their place, what would your reaction be? Be sure to tell me in the comments." Agent Holt's drive to the West Virginia site was long and silent. The further he moved from urban sprawl, the more time seemed to melt around him. Roads stretching longer, shadows leaning unnaturally. The last known location of the barefoot man was near an abandoned chapel just outside Larkspur County, a place swallowed by ivy and silence. Holt arrived before dawn. The door creaked open like it had been waiting for him. Inside, everything smelled of damp wood and old breath. Pews lay in crooked rows. Candles were melted down to the wick. But what struck Holt was the altar. Someone, or something, had carved a perfect spiral into the stone, mirroring the exact symbol Elias had drawn in condensation. Above it, etched into the wall, was a date, June 21st, 1906, and below it, in smaller letters, 1 began, 3 must end. Back at the facility, Elias had stopped eating altogether. When nurses asked what he needed, he simply replied, "The bell hasn't rung yet." He stared for hours at an old analog clock on the wall, 3:33 sharp, waiting for the minute hand to twitch. And when it did, he would whisper something under his breath. Names. Places. Scripture no one could trace. Holt documented every word, but one entry haunted him more than the rest. 3 names, spoken in reverse, echoed off the walls. Mason, Holt, Elias. The agent froze. Why had Elias included his name? Was this just psychological contamination, or was Holt now inside whatever countdown had begun back in 1958? 2 days later, local police in Larkspur found a fresh spiral carved into a tree near the chapel. Below it, a leather-bound book, wet from dew, containing only 3 entries. 1. Mason, sideways. 2. Elias, backward. 3. Holt, waiting. The last page was blank, except for one question written in red ink. Will the third walk in willingly? Holt shut the book. Somewhere behind him, a branch snapped, but no one was there. Holt didn't remember falling asleep, yet awoke at his desk with his fingers stained in ink and a spiral drawn in the center of every notepad around him. The time? 3:33 a.m. again. The wall clock had stopped. His phone had 7 missed calls from a number listed as unknown. And Elias? He was standing in the hallway, alone, outside the locked room he'd never left. Security footage later showed something else entirely. Elias had never moved, but Holt swore he saw him, heard his voice in the air vent. You're not just investigating this, Darren. You're part of the return. He tried to shake it off, chalk it up to fatigue, paranoia, but he couldn't ignore what Anne Delaney told him the next day. She said Holt's name was in Elias's journal in a page dated 1957. He said someone would come for him, a federal man with smoke on his breath and glass in his eyes. Holt didn't smoke, but he had glassy eyes, born with a minor corneal condition he'd had since birth. Coincidence? He wasn't sure anymore. Later that evening, Elias asked for one thing: access to soil. Not food, not books, just soil. When pressed, he explained, memory is not stored in the mind. It's kept in the ground. Where the spiral touches earth, the veil softens. It was the kind of phrase Holt had dismissed from 1,000 lunatics, but not from Elias, not after what he'd seen. At Elias's request, a small tray of dirt from Arden's Hollow, the site of the original church, was brought in. As soon as he touched it, he convulsed. Not violently, more like alignment. His hands began to trace symbols into the dirt instinctively, symbols Holt later matched to 1906 cultist blueprints archived in a hidden section of the Tennessee State Library, ones never digitized, ones Elias could not possibly know existed. And then Elias opened his eyes and said softly, the spiral doesn't just go back, it burrows, and when it finds what it needs, it brings it forward. Holt didn't sleep that night. Outside the facility, snow fell where no snowfall had been forecast for weeks. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, from a retired librarian in Nashville who, after hearing whispers of the case on late-night radio, mailed Holt an unlabeled envelope with no return address. Inside, a single brittle page stamped 1906. At the top, in faded ink, the phrase read, Initiation of the Three, the Triad Doctrine. Below it were 3 child silhouettes, each marked with a direction, one labeled backward, one sideways, one rooted. Names were not included, but the center figure bore a marking identical to Elias's wrist scar. The page was classified confidential orphanage ledger copy. Holt traced the origin to a long-shuttered institution outside Chattanooga, the Mercy Hollow home for displaced children. Records were scarce. Fires, floods, budget cuts. But within a basement archive, hidden behind a false wall, Holt discovered a 1955 intake log. The first name on the page, Elias Varnum. The next, Mason Rell. The third line had no name, just a scribbled note. Withheld. Placed by the flame. Elias, when shown the document, didn't flinch. He simply said, I told them I'd go backward if it meant someone else didn't have to. There was no pride in his voice, just fatigue, regret, as if sacrifice had become his only language. Holt pressed him again. Why children? Why not the cult elders themselves? Elias looked down, brushing his fingers across the table like he was touching something older than memory. Because children don't resist as hard. They still believe in doors that open to the unseen. He described the rituals in fragments, how at age 9 he and 2 others were taken beneath the chapel's honed symbols in candlelight, told that their souls would be preserved as gifts to time itself. The spiral wasn't about destruction. It was about filtration. The cult believed sin accumulated over generations like dust, and only the innocent could walk the spiral without being burned. Holt scribbled every word down, yet something gnawed at him. If there were three, and Elias was the one who returned, and Mason had gone sideways, then who was the third child, and where had they been rooted? Outside, the snow turned to rain, and for the first time in weeks, thunder cracked across a clear sky. Holt couldn't shake the feeling that the missing third child, the one marked rooted, wasn't lost, but waiting. The phrase kept surfacing in his notes, in Elias's mutterings, even in the dreams that had begun to bleed into waking life. In those dreams, Holt stood in an endless field of withered corn, the sky bruised purple, and heard a child's voice humming a lullaby in reverse. Every time he turned toward the sound, he woke up with dirt beneath his nails. He dug deeper into the records at Knoxville's old university archive, gaining access to sealed microfilms from a 1961 FBI surveillance program known as Project Marion Flame, an offshoot of COINTELPRO focused on suppressing rural cult movements post-Waluwitu. One photo in the film strip stood out. A young boy, face partially obscured, standing beside an older man cloaked in ceremonial vestments. The boy's wrist showed a mark, not a spiral, but a root system, branching downward. Handwriting beneath the photo, Subject 3, Doctrine, Containment, observed near Hollow Mercy Cemetery, 1958. Holt showed the image to Elias, who immediately looked away. He wasn't chosen to leave. He was told to stay, to hold the wound shut from the inside. Elias explained that the spiral worked both ways. Backward, traveled memory. Sideways, warped reality. But rooted? That was the anchor, the soul tied to earth, time, and consequence. The cult believed that to keep the other two from collapsing time entirely, one had to stay behind, suffering, absorbing, and never aging. He never screamed, Elias whispered. Even when the fire came, he just knelt and closed his eyes. Holt felt cold creep through him. The weather outside had shifted again, humidity rising even though it was January. Elias was trembling now, not from fear but recognition. "He's still there," he said. "He's the reason I got out." That night, Holt reviewed the old cemetery map from Hollow Mercy. Near the western edge, under an unmarked willow, a burial site listed as null record, no coffin, and next to it, etched faintly on the gravestone base, walked, stayed, returned. Only 2 of those had happened. 1 remained. It was the silence that told Holt the truth. The way Elias stopped speaking, how the clock outside his room ticked backwards for the first time. At exactly 3:33 a.m., Holt stood in front of the mirror in the facility's debriefing room, tying his tie before a scheduled press session. But when he blinked, the reflection didn't mimic him. It stared back, delayed by seconds. And then the reflection smiled. Not him. Something wearing him. Holt stumbled back, gasping, gripping the counter as nausea flooded him. On the mirror's surface, condensation formed 3 words in perfect script. "He has returned." Rushing to Elias's chamber, he found the boy collapsed, blood dripping from his nose, murmuring a phrase over and over. 3 is closure. He rooted you. You didn't choose this. Elias pointed to Holt's arm. There, under the skin, a faint outline had begun to glow, a spiral entwined with root branches, forming a hybrid symbol never documented before. "You were never the 3rd investigator," Elias whispered. "You were the 3rd child. They changed your name, buried the memory. You didn't wake up. You were planted." Every file Holt had found, every whisper in his dreams, the spiral drawings in his notes, they weren't discovery. They were recollection. The rooted child hadn't stayed behind. He had come back, as Holt himself, and now the spiral had all 3. The lights flickered, doors locked on their own. Outside, The wind carried whispers that had no mouths, and in the hollow Mercy Cemetery, beneath the unmarked willow, a new crack opened in the earth, releasing breath from soil that had waited a century to exhale. Part 2. Teaser. But if the spiral had completed, why did time not stop collapsing? And who was sending the warnings from beyond the mirror? Was there a fourth? If this story shook you, like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends. For more episodes and the next part, hit the bell icon and comment part 2 now so we can release it early for you.